Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Michael Adams, and I'm president of the Nebraska World Affairs Council, and which we affectionately call NUAC. So I'm happy to welcome all of you to today's webinar on the future of international exports and investments, prospects for Nebraska, which I'm sure you'll find fascinating. I'll take a minute to introduce the Nebraska World Affairs Council, and then I will introduce our two guest speakers, Bryan Slone and Koley Jessen. I would like to just mention a thank you to Jerry Javits and the Bread Breakers group who are using today's event as one of their weekly current affairs luncheon meetings. Well, the Nebraska World Affairs Council's roots go back to 1972, when we were originally known as the Omaha World Affairs Council. We're definitely looking forward to our 50th anniversary, which comes up next year. We're a nonpartisan nonprofit membership organization, and our mission is to provide educational programs and engagement opportunities together with our several partners to the three targeted sectors we've identified: students, young professionals, and community leaders, so that they may become competent, informed global citizens in this very complex and interconnected world that we all live in. We encourage citizen-to-citizen diplomacy as a way to promote peace and mutual respect so that we may all thrive. Well, why do Nebraskans care about world affairs anyway? Well, we will find out the answer to that question in today's presentations. I invite all of you to follow us on Facebook and LinkedIn to learn about our programs and events. Global citizens are needed here. Please consider joining us. Thank you. Now I would like to introduce the guest speakers, experts on international trade today. I'll begin with Bryan Slone. Bryan is the president of the Nebraska Chamber of Commerce and Industry. He became president in May of 2018, about 2.5 years ago, and he has lived in a number of Nebraska communities throughout the state. As an attorney and accountant, Bryan brings more than 3 decades of policy and business experience to the state chamber. Prior to his arrival at the chamber, he was a tax attorney with Koley Jessen in Omaha, where he advised business clients on legal matters related to taxation, administrative law, international law, mergers and acquisitions, and also government affairs. Prior to Koley Jessen, he was the managing partner for Deloitte in their Nebraska office in Omaha, one of the nation's largest professional service firms. In the 1990s, Bryan worked in Berlin, Germany as a tax attorney, and while he was there, he co-founded a law firm known as Wilmer Cutler Pickering. And prior to that, in the 1980s, Bryan spent a lot of time in Washington, where he was legal advisor to the IRS Commissioner, as well as serving on the House Ways and Means Committee as a staff member under former U.S. Rep. Hal Daub of Nebraska. In this capacity, he helped to shape the 1986 federal tax law. Thanks for that, Bryan. Bryan was also a candidate for Nebraska governor in 2014. He holds a law degree from the University of Nebraska and a bachelor's degree in business administration, also from the University of Nebraska at Lincoln. The state chamber has proudly served as the voice of Nebraska's business community since 1912. They have approximately 1,200 members statewide, and the chamber's mission is to protect all aspects of a free enterprise system while making Nebraska an even better place to do business. Pretty lofty and important goals, I would say. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Koley Jessen. Koley is the Director of International and Business Recruitment at the Department of Economic Development in Lincoln. In this role, he assists Nebraska companies with exports, joint ventures, new market entry, and works with foreign and domestic companies interested in expanding in Nebraska. Koley is also responsible for the state's promotional activity in these areas, with engaging with our 2 foreign trade offices in Germany and Japan. He has organized multiple governor-led trade missions to Europe and Asia, and also coordinates with various state and national agencies to promote the state of Nebraska overseas. He also hosts regularly inbound trade missions of overseas businesses interested in Nebraska products and possibly investing in Nebraska. Prior to working with the department, he spent 3 years studying and working in Asia. 2 of those years were in China, where Koley worked for the Frontier Program. He was researching agricultural development. Most of the research focused on food safety and supply chain management in the Chinese dairy industry. and the development of the Chinese aquaculture industry. His findings have been published in the Wiley Handbook of Science and Technology for Homeland Security, as well as other publications. In 2012, Kovas received a Fulbright Research Scholarship, which took him to Kazakhstan, where he spent a year at Kimep University in Almaty, researching border trade between China and the former Soviet Union. Kovas holds a bachelor's degree in international relations from the University of Wyoming, as well as an MBA from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Kovas speaks advanced Chinese and basic Russian. So I think you'll find this fascinating. We have two of the topics which in the state today. So now it's my pleasure to hand it off to today's moderator, Adrienne Cavil, also a member of NUAC.
Great, thank you for that, Michael. I'll quickly introduce the format, which is each of our presenters will speak for about 15 to 20 minutes each, and then we'll have about 15 to 20 minutes at the very end for questions. So if you do have questions, please just put those in the chat box and we'll read them off at the end. And thanks, guys. Let's dive in, Bryan.
Well, happy to be here and happy to do it. Let me share a screen with you here, which I want to talk a little bit from just the export side. When we talk about exports, we're going to talk a lot about competitive access and how do we create better economic ties around the world. But I think it's helpful to think about and understand a little bit about Nebraska's economy up front, because I think there's oftentimes a lot of misconceptions about not only what Nebraska's economy is now, but what it's going to be for the next 10 or 20 years and where our growth areas are going to be. And so when we talk about Nebraska's economy and exports, it's really important to understand that our economy, to a very large part in this state, notwithstanding what we see when we drive around Omaha or we drive around Lincoln, our economy is really very much dependent on both agriculture and manufacturing. And I'll talk a little bit about transportation, which is tied to the two. And not surprisingly, as we think about Nebraska's exports, we're very much tied to these two industries. So I want to talk about these two industries just to level set the discussion a little bit before we get into exports and export policy. I think everybody understands that agriculture is our largest industry in the state. Farm receipts, $21.4 billion. Other services directly to agriculture raise that to $27.4 billion. That's roughly 18% of our GDP of Nebraska. Just under 20% of our GDP in Nebraska is related to ag output. And we've got about 45,000 farms and ranches within the state. And within those, just about half of those farms and ranches produce protein products in the form of livestock or poultry. And that becomes important as we talk about our ag exports. Jobs related to ag in Nebraska, 25% in one way or another are related to our ag industry. We have an issue in Nebraska in that our average farmer age is 56.4. I'm 63. My days of riding horses or doing anything like that are numbered at this point. I can feel it every morning when I get up. Average farmhand salary, just a labor on a farm, is over $16 an hour. That's a little bit above the national average of all industries. So none of this surprises anybody. Ag is core to Nebraska's business, and it's core actually to the economies, urban and rural, across the state. And so one of the things you'll see with the pandemic economics in our state is Nebraska's going to come out of the pandemic maybe better than any other state in the country, with some of the lowest unemployment, but beyond that, perhaps the lowest affected GDP. I think once we get past the federal monies that have been flowing through all the states, and there's still months of that left, and the economies in each of the states goes back to a normal economy without federal stimulus money, most of the states, if not all, will find that their GDP has been affected pretty significantly from the pandemic. But in Nebraska's case, that might be 5% or less in terms of the effect. And largely because of these two industries. Agriculture has actually done well during the pandemic, and agriculture had a good year this past year. The second largest industry in Nebraska is manufacturing. And manufacturing output is, again, 14.12 billion, or about 12% of the GDP. And so you can see when you put these two things together, manufacturing and ag, it's about 30% of our GDP in this state. In terms of the number of manufacturers, sorry for the typo, we've got over 1,500 manufacturers in this state. And our manufacturing is in many ways tied to that agricultural market. So food and beverages is our number one product, but we also chemicals, a lot of those are ag chemicals. And then machinery and fabricated metal, a lot of that is ag equipment, ag grain storage, and other ag machinery. Employment in the manufacturing industry in Nebraska is 100,000 people. We only have 1.9 million in the state. We only have about 1 million who are employed. So this is about 10% of our non-farm employment. So 1 out of every 10 workers in this state works in a manufacturing capacity, some way associated with manufacturing. From a compensation standpoint, manufacturing jobs are much better paid than the average non-manufacturing job within the state. And those numbers are going up as manufacturing. The biggest limitation we have in the state right now to continued manufacturing growth is labor. It's just impossible to find workforce now. We're not to exports yet, but it's really important to understand these two industries and then the third that's attached before we jump into export policy for Nebraska. Tied to both of these industries is transportation. And transportation is either our third or fourth largest industry within the state, depending on how you want to count it. We have one of the largest railroads headquartered in this state in the world. We have several of the largest trucking companies. We are a transportation logistics hub as a state. That's really important because as we get to exports and we start thinking about agriculture and manufacturing, the key for agriculture and manufacturing in terms of growing exports is not only our international relationships, but having the logistics and transportation infrastructure to be able to actually get this product to markets and do so on a timely basis. And so this is also one part of it. You put those three industries together, agriculture, manufacturing, and transportation, you're getting close to 40% of our GDP in the state. And when we look at where we're going to grow for the next 10 or 20 years, I think everybody understands we're going to grow in technology, but just to say we're going to grow in technology doesn't get to really where the output's going to be. We will bring inevitably technology companies to the state that don't have anything to do with ag and manufacturing. But frankly, these two industries have been identified by most people who've researched it as the place where technology growth is going to happen the fastest over the next 10 years. So here we have Nebraska with its two major industries being the areas where technology is going to grow the fastest in the next 2 years. In the case of agriculture, we are not far at all from combines and planters that don't have seats for anybody to drive them, where there will be equipment running in the fields in terms of the grain producers all night long in the dark, planting and harvesting. And the technology involved is incredible. Similarly, in the livestock area, there's already been big movements to technology-based livestock production. And most cattle feeders today would tell you that they're the technology business, not the ag business. Why is this important as we start talking about exports? As ag and manufacturing, which is quickly becoming automated, grow, their most valuable assets will be their technologies and their data. Speaking to a farmer the other day, he said, I can see in 5 to 10 years where the data that I'm pulling off my equipment and my pivot irrigation and the data I have on my fields is my most valuable asset. And it's something that I need to keep confidential in this process. So with that, let me finally get to talking about exports. So when we look at exports within the state, in 2020, exports are going to be just under 7 billion, about 60% of those. And that's not going to be surprising after we kind of went through our economy. 60% of our exports are food commodities, meat, soybean, corn, wheat, and mostly vegetable oils, and then animal proteins and parts, of which hides are a very large part of that export market. Beyond that, equipment, machinery, transportation, chemicals, natural gas, and pharma, pharma is our fastest growing export area. In terms of who we trade with as a state, Not surprisingly, Mexico and Canada are our largest trade partners, constituting 23 and 19% of our business in 2020. They flipped. Historically, Canada has tended to be a slightly larger trade partner than Mexico, but they're about on the same pace. But Mexico is now our largest trade partner, and particularly in the ag product area, Mexico is our largest export market. Japan rounds out what I would call the big three in terms of historic export markets for the United States, and not for the United States, but for Nebraska, Mexico, Canada, and Japan. That has been influenced by specific agreements with Japan. And then you'll note the rest, a lot of Asia Pacific makes out the rest of our export markets. So when you think about our current export markets, again, food and manufacturing are leading the way on our exports. Who do we export to? Mexico, Canada, primarily, and Japan is our third, but our fastest growing is going to be the Asia Pacific area. And so let me take that and introduce the subject, which is not going to surprise anybody, is do free trade and open markets matter? And it becomes the most essential thing in terms of our export growth and the policies that the US government as well as foreign governments take or don't take around free trade and open markets. Why it's important, I'll just point out volatility for nothing else, just as an opening to that conversation. In 2020, there was some pretty extreme volatility in Nebraska exports. Canada was down 16%, Japan was down 10%, but China was up 27%. Taiwan was down 28%, Hong Kong is down 22%. Those are very material shifts in a single year for Nebraska exports. And what that highlights to me from a chamber standpoint is the work that DED does, and certainly the work that the governor's been doing, are absolutely essential. Because when you think of those two major industries, agriculture and manufacturing, those are not nimble industries, particularly agriculture, to make mid-year changes based on what's happening in export markets. Farmers and ranchers make decisions early in a year what they're going to do, and this kind of volatility is very difficult. The governor's done a very good job of, and I think Cobus can talk to us about some of the trade missions, but getting to the specific countries where our exports are absolutely critical and helping brand Nebraska exports in those areas. I'll just give you an example in terms of Farm Bureau. If you were to ask the Farm Bureau today, what are their most important trade issues with the new administration in DC, and I'm taking this right off their website, they would say three things. One is China. While Canada and Mexico are our most important export markets, China has the potential to be very, very impactful over the next several years. Certainly during the Trump administration, there was both a slowdown in ag exports as those trade disputes gathered early in his term. Toward the end of the term, China made a commitment to buy particularly more grain, soybeans, and corn, but also livestock and protein. China has basically been complying, not completely complying, but basically more recently been complying with that agreement, which extends through 2021. The effect of China has had a very significant effect on the effect of commodity prices and has been very important to Nebraska's economy for a year. The pace at which China buys soybeans, corn, oils, and protein in the future will have a very dramatic effect on our farm economy and on our economy as a whole within the state. In terms of expanding international markets, and I'll let Cobus highlight some of this a little bit later, but the governor, and indeed his predecessor, but this governor particularly, has been very effective at branding Nebraska products in places like Japan and in Mexico, and in Mexico, particularly ag products, and expanding our international markets, but also looking to expand them in places like Vietnam. And that's really important. And what we have found through the trade missions is this one-to-one relationship is important. And I think you all know that, and I certainly know that from my living abroad, is relationships are everything. And so Nebraska businesses and the Nebraska governor need to be abroad. And we've been very successful when we have been. And the last is the World Trade Organization, which is not the organization it was 20 years ago. And beefing up that organization's ability to resolve old trade disputes, at least, is really important. So let's talk about trade negotiations, trade policy as they affect exports at this point. I would say if the new federal administration is just getting its feet on the ground in terms of what its trade policies are going to be. So I'm only borrowing this from their trade representatives' initial disclosures. I am sure trade policy will continue to evolve just like it would in any presidency. But basically what they've said is initially they're focusing on primarily pharma supply chains and the COVID crisis. And so the first things we're going to see is primarily from the federal administration is going to be COVID-related pharma supply chain work to try to speed up vaccines and other items important to the COVID pandemic. This administration is going to talk a lot more about other issues in the context of their trade negotiations. The prior administration was primarily focused on intellectual property, maintaining intellectual property rights, and two, creating trade balances with places like China. This administration has announced that it's also going to be focused on equitable global growth, that they're going to be a little more focused on protecting U.S. labor and increasing U.S. wages, on protecting the environment and advancing racial equity. That's going to change the trade debates with a number of these countries. And again, particularly China. It's unknown exactly where that relationship is going to go. With the current Trump deal running through 2021, some new agreement and some new relationship with China is going to be very important to Nebraska beginning in 2022. From Governor Ricketts' standpoint, as I mentioned before, he's been very successful in trade missions, particularly in Canada, Mexico, and Japan, but also reaching out in Asia Pacific and in Europe, and in particularly, I would say in the UK and Germany. And the UK is really important now because with its exit from the European Union, the UK is negotiating its own trade agreements at this point. And when we think about these trade missions, the key is not only to increase our exports, but to create a true bilateral economic tie. We need to open up these export markets, and we need to create Nebraska branding. So actually something the chamber is working with manufacturers now, and will be working a lot harder in the next year or two, is developing a brand around things that are actually manufactured, processed, or grown in Nebraska. I think it's very brandable and could be appealing overseas. But as we create these new markets for exports, there's also a really important opportunity to create more investment in Nebraska with foreign businesses coming in. And I'll use this as a transition to COBUS. We talk about it every day with our manufacturers, is the pandemic interrupted supply chains, and that became very difficult for our manufacturing industry. There is, and they've estimated it, somewhere around 25% of the foreign supply chain the U.S. manufacturers have been reliant on may move back to the United States. And so we spend a lot of time every day talking about how do we get more supply chain back into the U.S. And a big part of that is getting our foreign partners and supply chain partners to invest in their own facilities in the United States and hopefully in Nebraska to produce and to create a more reliable supply chain here in the U.S. And you're going to be hearing, certainly from the Biden administration, efforts to move a lot more of the, for instance, the pharmaceutical manufacturing back into the United States. And that's an area where Nebraska already has a very important toehold on that industry and something we should grow. So hopefully that's a good transition to where COBUS and the administration is going. I'm really happy to be on the panel with COBUS today. DED does fabulous work for this state and is sort of the beginning and end of where companies should be at this point. So I'm going to turn this over to COBUS.
Thanks a lot, Brian. That was a great overview, and I think as far as for the giving people a background on exports and the industries, I think it ties in really well with what I'm going to talk about here next. So I'm happy to be with everybody today, and thank you for NUAC for this opportunity to present to you all. I hope you can see my screen. If I can get a thumbs up from somebody. Good. I am, as Bryan mentioned, I head up our international effort here at the Department of Economic Development. Bryan handled the exports side of things really well, so I'm not even going to hardly touch on that. I'm happy to answer questions at a later time period, but I'm going to focus primarily on what the state is doing on the foreign direct investment angle. So real quick, just as kind of an overview, our international team, we kind of see ourselves as having three mandates. The first is to support exporters generally. We have a variety of different resources that we provide, whether that's training or assistance, matchmaking services. And then one of our more successful programs, a state trade export program, which provides reimbursement for expenses, qualified expenses that small companies incur while promoting exports through activities like overseas sales missions or overseas sales trips, or attending trade shows in countries overseas. In addition to that, then we focus on growing investment in the state. This year, the department has combined the international team with the domestic recruitment team, and so we're working more closely together. I lead both of those teams now. So we are focused both on, international companies coming to the United States, but also Nebraska or U.S. companies that might be trying to reshore some of their production, as Bryan mentioned. And then finally, we're basically a promotional office for the state. So we have overseas offices that I'll talk about later, and we coordinate with partners across the state, like the Nebraska Chamber of Commerce and Industry, the University of Nebraska system, and other partners in order to promote the state abroad. So first off, according to the U.S. Foreign Commercial Service, they estimate that international foreign direct investment in the state of Nebraska supports about 31,000 jobs. That covers a broad range of industries. So of course, a lot of those will be in industries that Bryan already talked about. The industries where we have a lot of strength: advanced manufacturing, food processing, but it's not limited to that. So we have companies in finance and fintech and insurance, in biosciences and renewables, a whole array of different industries. And the impact on the state is not limited to a few cities. The impact is felt all the way across the state. We have international companies with investments from Omaha to Scotts Bluff. We have Japanese companies making capacitors in Ogallala. We have Mexican companies making food products in the center part of the state. It's all over, and it covers a huge variety of different products. So as you can see, where does FDI come from? This is a select group of countries. These tend to be our largest investors. And then down below, you can see the logos of a few different companies. Again, focus on food processing industry, as you would expect, but then also advanced manufacturing. And in the case of GSK, it's that pharma or medical science that Bryan mentioned already. What does this investment look like? It can be it can have a variety of different forms. One of the key components of investment would be a company investing in an existing Nebraska company or purchasing an existing Nebraska company and then growing it here. Here are three examples of how that kind of takes place. Monolith Materials is a hydrogen company based outside of Lincoln, Nebraska. They recently received a substantial investment from Mitsubishi Heavy Industries. Mitsubishi is trying to get into the hydrogen field and wants to use it for both automotive and also for energy production needs. And so they made a substantial investment into that company. Gavilon is a homegrown Nebraska company, a large grain merchandising company. They were acquired a number of years ago by Marubeni, which is one of the largest trading houses in the world based out of Tokyo. That is one of our largest investments from Japan, and it came about in the form of an acquisition. CropX is an Israeli company. They acquired Crop Metrics, which is another Nebraska-based company, and they have since been growing and collaborating with Rinke, which is, of course, another well-known Nebraska company. Outside of mergers, acquisitions, and investment in local companies, we also see greenfield investment. So greenfield investment is when a company comes in and picks a greenfield, an open site, and builds from scratch and starts up their location in the state. Here are 3 examples. Up top is the grand opening for Veramaris. Veramaris is a joint venture between Royal DSM, which is a Dutch company, and Evonik, which is a German company. They are making omega-3 fatty acids for the salmon aquaculture industry using Nebraska corn as their feedstock. On the bottom right, you have Grapel. Grapel is a metal perforation company. They make the grills for Corvettes. They make the grills for John Deere tractors. They make a whole variety of different parts for the automotive, the mining, the agriculture, the power generation industries. They started out in Omaha with a one-man sales office quite a few years ago, and they've grown it and expanded 3 times. They now employ about 50 employees in Omaha, do all their manufacturing locally, and we are hopeful to see them expand again in the near future. And then on the bottom left is kind of our showcase for the state of Nebraska, Kawasaki Motor Manufacturing. Kawasaki has been in the state for well over 40 years. They are one of our most influential investors in the state, and they employ, I think, close to 3,000 people in Lincoln currently. This is their opening of their first ever aeronautics division in the United States. That happened a couple of years ago. So now that I've given you kind of a good overview of what sort of investment looks like in the state of Nebraska, I'll go into kind of what our sales pitch is, because that's essentially what our job is. We're a sales arm for the state. Our work is to, first of all, go out and try and identify companies to come in and locate in Nebraska, tell them why Nebraska would match what they're trying to accomplish. And then help them to work around any sort of issues that they might run into, find the appropriate site and all of that. We have a great product to sell. Nebraska is a great place to do business. And we have strong industry associations like Nebraska Chamber of Commerce that are helping to push it toward being a better place to do business. We have been successful in our efforts to develop the state. You know, in 2016, 17, and 18, we won the Site Selections Silver or Gold Cup Award for having most economic development projects per capita. We have been recognized as a business-friendly location, whether that's in a regulatory environment or cost of doing business, and just a good place to do business overall. Of course, any business that we approach is not going to be immediately convinced by those numbers, and they want to see kind of what the state can offer them and how we can make their business successful here. And one of our main tools as an agency is the tax credit program that the state legislature has put in place. The previous iteration of this program was known as Nebraska Advantage. It was updated last year, and the new program is called Imagine Nebraska. It's been updated and, I would argue better, but it's essentially the same program in terms of what it is attempting to do. It's a statutory program that essentially rewards companies for their investment through tax credits that they earn given performance. So a company will come in and make an application to the program, and based on the level of investment and jobs created and the wage level, then they will claw back a percentage of that investment in the form of tax credits that they can use to offset tax liabilities that they incur in the state. That's a very simplified version of the program, but it's a great program for companies to use, and it's definitely one of our primary tools in terms of how we attempt to sell the state. Outside of Imagine Nebraska, which is a statutory program, so we don't have discretion over who gets that or not. If they make the application and then they follow through on the investment level, they reap those tax benefits regardless of what we think. We have, in addition to that program, we have discretionary funds. So discretionary funds will go to a project that we think would be beneficial for the state. There's a project review committee internal to the department that reviews those projects after they receive an economic analysis, impact analysis. And those are two funds that are in our department. The first is the Site and Building Development Fund, which essentially provides funds to the local economic development authority to either make improvements to the site or to help make the site ready for entry by the company. And then the second is customized job training, which goes to companies to help them take employees that would be at a lower wage level, provide them training that would get them to a higher wage level inside the company. And then the final program is administered by the Department of Transportation. This is called the Economic Opportunity Program. And it funds, say, the addition of a turn lane in a road, or widening of a road, or even providing a rail spur in order to help that company have access to the transportation infrastructure that would allow the project to go forward. And then finally, in terms of how we sell the state, we rely on testimonials. And so again, this is one of our kind of premier examples as a state. Kawasaki has not only been a great presence by themselves, but they've also worked with us to help get other Japanese companies or other suppliers that they need to have close to come to Lincoln, Nebraska. And from the staff here in Lincoln all the way up through their leadership in Japan, they've been very supportive and willing to tell about the good experience they've had for their long-term investment here in the state. And then outside of that, we try and highlight that this is a great place to live. If people want to have a location that their employees are going to be happy, that their employees can live a good life without an exorbitant salary, and they can have access to a lot of amenities that are not necessarily available in other states. And we think that we have a great product there to sell as well. So that's how we kind of go about looking at convincing companies to come to the state. I'm now going to talk a little bit about how we figure out what we're going to target. So this year specifically, we are targeting agribusiness and food processing, biosciences, and then agricultural machinery or technology. And how we decide what to target is partly based on the strengths of our state. As Bryan mentioned, agriculture is top of mind in the state. We have a lot of those resources available, and we have a lot of expertise and know-how here. So it makes sense for us to target those. These three specific industries on the screen were highlighted by the SRI International report that we had done a number of years ago. Those findings were reiterated by Blueprint Nebraska that was done more recently. And so then using these industries, we worked with the Foreign Commercial Service to identify which countries are the source of the most greenfield investment in those industries. So one of the tricky things about looking into investment numbers for the United States generally is that they always include merger and acquisition numbers in their findings. And actually that's kind of that's the majority. And those are definitely things that we want to encourage, but a lot of times it's not something that we can go out and recruit. Number one, because we can't, it's potentially risky to try and recruit a company to come in and buy a company in Nebraska. You can imagine if somebody bought a Nebraska company and then closed it down and moved operations elsewhere, that would not be something we want to see happen. But number two, we want to see that greenfield investment because that's a larger, more substantial investment in the community. So if you look at this, then you can see there's some definitely some countries that keep on repeating, Germany and Japan, but also countries like France and Canada keep popping up again and again. So based on that kind of information and kind of those industries, we decided to target, and these are just some examples. So we are also working in other areas as well, but these are some places where we are trying to put a lot of effort. So ag tech is a good example of this. I've got some logos down here on the bottom, and you'll notice that it kind of looks strange because it doesn't include some of our more obvious brands, right? So Lindsay, Rinke, Valmont, Balin, Chief. I mean, they're very big players in the state of Nebraska, and I purposely didn't include them because I wanted to kind of show that, I mean, outside of that, there's a lot of other stuff going on. CNH Industrial is actually counts as a foreign direct investment, given their after the merger with Fiat, so it's an Italian company. And Klaus, of course, is a German company. Cropx I mentioned already with the Israeli connection there. So we have had presences at ag tech shows across the world for a number of years. We're trying to ramp that up. We're trying to highlight what Bryan talked about as far as the improvements in technology, access to customers here in the Midwest, not just in Nebraska, but in all of our surrounding states, Iowa, Kansas, South Dakota, et cetera. And also the unique selling point that Nebraska has, where we have a mix of both livestock operations and grain or row crop operations. And then finally, Nebraska has a unique status as being being the largest irrigated state. And so our knowledge about how irrigation systems work and the data that you can collect off of those systems makes us really competitive when we're talking to some of the tech companies specifically. So on that side, I mean, on ag tech, there's, we can focus number one on both the large manufacturers, but we can also look at the really cool startup scene in ag tech and see how we can develop some of that. And then another example of an industry that we want to focus in on and have been focusing in on for the last few years is what we call industrial biotech. So bioscience usually gets broken up into two different categories. One is medical focused and the other is this industrial biotech. Industrial biotech is essentially using grain, corn as a feedstock, specifically the sugar content or starch content in corn as a feedstock for a variety of different chemical purposes. So Evonik makes amino acids, Novozymes makes enzymes, all of and then BioNebraska is an association of companies here in the state that helps to grow that industry in general. So a good example of what this kind of looks like in the state of Nebraska is the Cargill campus in Blair. So Cargill has built a flagship campus in Blair that is a wet mill ethanol plant that then takes products from corn, breaks it out, and then sells it to these three companies, Evonik, Novozymes, and Corbion, who are co-located and then use those different products to make new and other products. So we want to replicate some of that and see that grow around the state. We have 27 ethanol plants across the state that we think could see some sort of a similar process, and we want to make use of that as a resource to draw in some of these companies. So after we've kind of identified where we're looking, we go out and try and sell the state. So this takes place not only on recruiter trips, individual people. Adrian has gone to France, the Netherlands, and other countries around the world to promote Nebraska for us. We have a team of people who travel on a regular basis, or at least did travel previous to COVID. And then we also work with our elected officials, governor, lieutenant governor, to promote the state on a larger scale. So the governor is very beneficial because, of course, he gets attention. So I can't always get a meeting with the company, but if I tell them the governor is coming, we can get a meeting with somebody who actually can make a difference. And so we have made use of that a lot. Governor Ricketts has been very willing to go out and build relationships and to maintain them. So here are just a selection of some of the more recent trade missions that we've done. And you can see that some of this is a mix of both that export promotion and then also the foreign direct investment. Japan, of course, is important both as a destination for our exports, but also as an investment source. Mexico is as well. Lala is a large investor here in the state, but Mexico is also a source or a destination for a lot of our products. Germany, we think, is probably one of our best targets for future growth and foreign direct investment. Korea also has some good opportunities there, but then as well is a massive market for our products. And then finally, we maintain a presence overseas besides the times that we travel, we have overseas trade offices that both act as a resource to exporters and then also as a recruiting strong point or foothold for us. And we have chosen Japan and Germany as locations for those offices. We also have a representative to China who helps with companies that need help there. And that's all I have for today. I'm happy to answer questions, but for now, I'm going to.
Great. Thank you both Cobus and Bryan for those presentations. We'll get into some questions now. And quickly, I'll say, I don't think I said before, I'm both on the NUAC board and I do work with Cobus at DED, as he alluded to in his presentation, but we'll start with a couple general questions. So Cobus and Bryan, you said that manufacturing, food processing, and biotech are some of the biggest industries in Nebraska. Do either of you see potential new sectors that could emerge, or do you think that those are just going to be kind of the continuing to grow sectors here in the state?
No, I think there's some other emerging sectors, and one thing that doesn't get caught up in our export numbers is that I think people know we have some of the most significant global architecture, engineering, and construction firms in the world, and they're doing business all over the world, and that doesn't always show up in our export numbers. That's going to continue to grow, and those are going to be really important. But I do also think there will be new technology companies, and so much of what we're going to be exporting is technology that's built in, whether it's built into ag or manufacturing or transportation or engineering. 10 years from now, we're going to be talking about a value proposition where much more of our technology transfers are going to be a bigger part of our exports. That's what I would see.
I would echo that. I think that on the tech side, we have a lot of startups here in the state that are doing a lot of really good work. Huddle has expanded very aggressively overseas, and I visited their offices in London and now last year, and they're all over the world now. And then on the recruitment side as well, Nebraska has done very good work on attracting data centers and kind of back end services for tech firms. And I think that's an area that we'll continue to see grow.
And to piggyback on that question, Cobus, we had someone ask if you would point out how 100% clean energy offerings in Nebraska can help attract some projects, and specifically, I think data centers is a great tie into that.
Yes, specifically, Omaha Public Power District has had some very innovative rate setups using their investment in renewable power that has got investments from Facebook and Google as a result. And that is definitely something that's of interest and will be of interest in the future.
Yep, great. One more kind of general question that either of you can field is someone asked about why Europe, South America, and Africa are not huge importers of Nebraska goods. Do we have a reason as to why that is? And do you think that those are markets that will continue to open to Nebraska exporters?
Yeah, I'll take a first shot at it. I do think these are big growing markets, and I know the governor has been very focused, particularly on the UK and Germany, but Europe as a whole. Not surprisingly, from a manufacturing standpoint, Germany is one of our major competitors in manufacturing, and from an ag standpoint, Europe is a major competitor. And so you wouldn't expect that they would be as large of importers of certain kinds of goods as some others. But as we move into more technologies and as we expand our economy, I think those growth areas are likely. I think the big three will still be important, but these other countries, including Europe and the UK, are going to become really important.
Yeah, I would say that I think the reason that you see that Asia is so important is if you look at the products that are going to Asia, they are commodities and beef, they're commodities and meat products, and so beef and pork. And so that's, I mean, just in terms of what we export, generally that takes up a huge chunk of what Nebraska exports. And so those are places with, very, very large populations, and in a lot of cases, not as robust agricultural systems. And so it's kind of a natural fit for us to be exporting there. In addition to that, say, for instance, with the European Union, there's a number of different trade restrictions, regulatory issues that make our products less competitive. Although, you can find Nebraska beef in any good-sized steakhouse across Europe. But it does exist, but it's more kind of niche products. the larger commodities I think are probably always going to be going towards Asia just because of the demographics.
Great, thanks. And I have a specific question for each of you pertaining to your presentation. So for Bryan, someone had a question about how the labor shortage that you mentioned might impact Nebraska's rankings and how that impacts what our workforce has to offer and how we're kind of addressing that.
So actually, all the states have a workforce shortage, but we tend to have a slightly bigger one per capita than others because we're tending to age as a state a little faster than other states right now. You saw this week, U.S. News and World Report rated Nebraska number 6 as best place to live. And part of the metrics they used was opportunity. And so this workforce shortage really creates, I can't remember a time in my lifetime when Nebraska's been a more attractive place for people to move to from a career and family standpoint. And we really need to take advantage of it. So our unemployment rate is really an asset in terms of attracting people. We could absorb 10,000 new people a year, and we could absorb them like this in Nebraska and have them fully employed. Right, on any given day in Nebraska, generally, there's over 30,000 jobs unfilled because we don't have the people. And so it creates an opportunity. It makes us very attractive when you combine that with our quality of life and the kinds of opportunities we have here.
Great. And then another question for Cobus. Are our incentives specifically for attracting new companies, or can they be applied to local startups or for companies that are expanding? And maybe you can get into maybe Innovation Act a little bit.
Yeah, all of those incentives are available regardless of where the company comes from. So they're not. There's no basis on either local or international. Everyone has equal access to those. On the incentive side of things, or on the startup side of things, we have a separate program that was established by the Business Innovation Act that provides a variety of different funds and programs for startups. And then we collaborate with Invest Nebraska, which is a separate organization, in order to invest in startups and to help them to grow.
Great. I'll ask one more kind of targeted question, and then we'll get into maybe some more theoretical or, I don't know, making some projections. But Cobus, what do you think that the trade missions are going to look like in this kind of new COVID era or post-COVID era? I don't think we can say post-COVID yet, but what are our plans for addressing COVID and recruitment?
Well, I've been wrong about the entire COVID situation since it started, and so I'm probably not a good person to ask. But I can tell you that we are still hoping to get at least one trade mission done this year. Later in the year, we will aim for probably say October, but it's all going to be contingent on what border restrictions look like outside of the United States. I would say that the one benefit of the COVID situation is that it's normalized meetings like this or events like this. And so I think everyone's much more comfortable getting on in a webinar. And so it has opened up some opportunities that maybe we didn't see in the past.
Great. And I know we're getting close to time. If people have to jump off, that's no problem. We'll try to get through all of your questions before ending this, though. So the next question I'll ask is a little bit maybe more theoretical. So we had some questions about China. So maybe a two-part question. First part being, do you both think that the tariffs against China were effective kind of sticks to put in place? Do you think that there were better options? Second part to that is, how does this kind of decoupling from China effort impact Nebraska businesses specifically, as we've kind of, distanced ourselves from the Chinese economy, maybe more so than we were 10 years ago? I'll let either of you take a stab.
Yeah, I'll take a first shot at that, and then Cobus, please clean up my mess when I'm done here. Look, I think the most effective trade is when you get a truly global effort with lots of our allies and lots of countries around the world really working towards free market principles, and that works best. There is China and the United States need each other inevitably from a trade standpoint, and so there inevitably is going to be trade. This technology issue has to be fixed, though, in my mind, before the trade relationship can be fixed permanently. We need interim trade agreements to continue to support Nebraska exports. But technology is going to continue to be a bigger and bigger part of what we produce in each one of our industries, including ag and manufacturing. And the amount of attempts, state-sponsored attempts to steal technology is increasing, not decreasing. And I'm hearing it from Nebraska companies every day, getting state-sponsored cybersecurity attacks. This has to be resolved. And so there has to be some sort of effective pressure, because that becomes part of open markets, is the ability to protect your own technologies and your own scientific developments. But within that context, ultimately we're going to have to come to a relationship with China from a trade standpoint that works. That's a win-win. But it's hard to think how we're going to get there until we solve that technology theft issue.
I'm going to provide a little bit more pessimistic view. I think that I agree that there's a lot of built-in reasons why the United States and China should get along and should have a good trading relationship. However, I think that sometimes in the United States we focus a little bit too much on what's going on here and not at the other side. And I would argue that the ship has already left in some instances about what the Chinese think this relationship should look like. And I would say that our relationship with China has been, tumultuous. It hasn't been a very reliable trading relationship for the state of Nebraska for the past, say, 10 years. And if you look at, so for instance, this last year, the Chinese slapped massive, what I would say arbitrary measures on Australian beef, wine, coal, barley, a variety of different things, because the Australian Prime Minister said that called for an independent investigation of the source of COVID-19. They have they tend to take asymmetrical attacks at countries, and it's not entirely reliable as to what that looks like. And so I think as a state, we need to seriously consider how we mitigate that risk. China is definitely an important market for us, but the reality is that we can't rely on that market always being there. And we have to ask, if tomorrow we were not able to sell any more to soybeans to China, what would we do? And so that's part of the reasoning behind the governor's decisions to focus on countries like Vietnam or Indonesia to try and soften some of that potential blow, and to put us in a situation where if something does go wrong, we're at least somewhat prepared.
Yeah, and I agree with Cobus that we should be focused more broadly on Asia Pacific in this context. And I saw you had a question on the Asia Trans-Pacific Partnership, but I think we have to think bigger than China in this context.
Yeah, I was just going to get into the question about the U.S. being involved in the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Do either of you think that that's a direction that we're going, that we should go, or willing to comment on that at this time?
I would say I would have to see the details. I do think the United States has to lead in trade discussions in terms of free and open trade, and make sure that we're an equal partner, and from a trade deficit standpoint with particular countries, that we're making strides on that. But to answer the question, I would be surprised that this new administration at least won't look at it. Whether it will consider rejoining or not, I don't know. But they're clearly taking a comprehensive relook at the entire trade relationships out there, and so I would expect within the next 6 months that we would start hearing on that subject.
I think that's a good answer. I won't have anything to add to that.
Okay, and then we just have two more questions. So one's kind of to the point. So question being, does Nebraska attract people of color or LGBT people? Or is that hard because it's more of a conservative red state? Maybe we can get into a little bit of how we're addressing the brain drain, because that tends to be maybe a university demographic. If either of you want to take a stab.
Yeah, I'll take that one. And Blueprint Nebraska, one of its 15 initiatives was to be known as a welcoming state for diversity. I think in many respects we are, but I also know that from a branding standpoint, There's a lot of assumptions. When I used to live on the East Coast before I came to Nebraska, people make assumptions about the Midwest that just aren't true unless you live here. I grew up in welcoming communities all over the state. And so I think we've got some work to do from a branding standpoint, so people really understand what an incredible state this is and what opportunities are available out there. So we've got some work to do from a branding standpoint. And that was part of the Blueprint initiatives and something that we'll be working on.
Yeah, I would say as far as the talent attraction side of it, I mean, that's something that we are actively trying to promote and reach out to people and kind of pull people into the state. One thing I would say, I think that, we can look at things two ways. Certainly we want to be welcoming to anybody, regardless of background or any other factors. But one, I think, area where as a state we need to focus more on is former Nebraskans. I think there's a lot of people who leave the state when younger that get to a point in their life where they come to reevaluate what they hold dear, and living in a family-friendly communities in small town Nebraska becomes really something that they want to do. And so I think we really do need to make a better effort of reaching out to people who have a connection back to the state. And primarily that's because, like Bryan said, there may be some bad press around the state that's not necessarily warranted, but people who have a connection to the state often know the true nature of it. So that would be the one additional thing I would say to that.
Great, thanks.
I think if you talk to any of the business leaders in the state, everybody is in search of talent. I think everybody in the business world appreciates the need and particularly to attract 18 to 34-year-olds. I think I'm becoming less and less of a commodity for businesses. I don't get many recruiting calls anymore at 63.
Great, thanks. And then very last question, and then we'll let you all out of here, from Gary Javich, which is, he was wondering to expand a little bit more on the relationship with Israel, as there were some initial connections related to water and irrigation with Israel. Where is that relationship at? Where is it going?
Yeah, so I mean, I can say that we've had really good movements on that front. We've had a number of discussions with Israeli government and research organizations trying to come up with collaborative efforts on a state to state level. But outside of that, again, CropX is that irrigation company that has invested in a Nebraska company. So they have a presence here, and then they're working with Rinke. Valmont has a collaborative effort with a Israeli company that I'm blanking on their name, but it has a very prominent collaboration there. And there's now I'm blanking on this name again, but there's another Nebraska company that just set up a small office and R&D facility here in Nebraska. So yeah, there's definitely a lot of opportunity, and we have seen movement.
And Gary's heard me say this before, 20 years from now, water will be our oil as a state. As water becomes a commodity that becomes more and more valuable, which it will globally. We sit over the biggest puddle in the world, and not only our water resource, but our water technology and our water research is second to none in the world. And that is going to become really valuable as we go down the road here.
Gary, if you're saying something, we can't hear you. Sorry about that. But yeah, that's all the questions. I think we've gotten through them all. Thank you to all of you who are able to stay a little bit after time. Michael, did you want to have any closing word before we close this out?
Yes, I'd just like to thank our speakers, Bryan and Kobus, for really fascinating presentations. And thanks everybody for joining us today. I just wanted to mention that our next guest speaker event is actually a week from today, next Wednesday evening at 7 p.m. The topic is going to be sports diplomacy. Believe it or not, the State Department does have a sports diplomacy group in it. So that should be very interesting, next Wednesday at 7 p.m. This session has been recorded, and we will be posting the recording on our YouTube channel in the next couple of days. Thanks again to everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you all.